One of the most important systems in all of the Exploration Toolkit is interactables. An interactable is essentially an object in your world that you want to be able to look at or hover over with your mouse and click to do something. Okay, this could be a door, a button, a lever, it could be a pin code in a number pad. Anything that you want to directly interact with is known as an interactable. Now, in order for interactables to work, our player needs to have the interaction controller. So let's go to our core, prefabs, and then over to controllers. And in here, we have the interaction controller. Now, let's drag that in as a child of the player. And then on player components, we want to go find next to interaction controller, and that is going to assign it here. Now, the interaction controller, let's actually set the object to be at 000. In its component, we have a number of settings. First of all, we have the interact method, and this basically defines what sort of interactions we want to be able to do with this controller. Now, by default, it's set to both, and this means that we can both interact with something by looking at it and then left-clicking, as well as if our mouse is enabled, hover over something and click on that as well. Okay, now, why would you want to use your mouse to be able to interact with something in the world? Well, if your camera detaches from the player and zooms in on a padlock, you might want to be able to click on the individual dials, and that's what we do there. Now, that doesn't mean every interactable can actually be triggered by the mouse. You can go ahead and manually set up and define if you want the barrel here, for example, to detect mouse, world, or both as well. And then we have their corresponding ranges, okay, the maximum distance, as well as a layer mask and a checks per second, which essentially means how many times per second are we going to be shooting out the raycast. Now, you could make this every frame if you want, but having it at around 30 times per second really doesn't have that much of a visual difference, yet saves on performance. Now, down inside of the inspecting dropdown, you'll see an inspect camera property here. This is only needed if you have an inspect system, and the reason why we have this is so that when we are inspecting an object, since it uses its own separate camera to render the inspected object, we need to know which camera we need to shoot the raycast from. Then down here in advanced, we have a bunch of other settings, which of course you can just hover over in order to understand what they do, but we're just going to leave those as they are. Now, to be able to interact with the barrel, what we're going to do is select it, and we are going to add the interactable component. The interactable component, essentially what we can do. Now, on the interactable component, there's a number of different settings. We can first of all enable or disable the interaction. So if you want, for example, an interaction not to be usable until a certain time in the game, then you can disable that. We can then change the method. Right now it is set to world, so that means we can only interact with this if we are looking at it with our camera. If we change this to cursor, that means our cursor has to be enabled in order for us to click on it. Or we could set it to both, but most interactables are going to be world. We could then set a prompt text, which is a text that appears when we hover over this, that's an optional thing, and a crosshair. Now, if you have no crosshair here, nothing's going to happen, but what we can do is change what crosshair appears when we are hovering over the barrel. So let's just say we want to inspect this barrel maybe, so we would change this to maybe be a magnifying glass. And then we have some other settings that we can kind of just leave as is, but if you want a cooldown, you can enable has cooldown, which basically means we can only interact with this a certain number of times. Then down in events, we can connect these up to respective things when we interact with it, when we enter the interactable, so when we start looking at it or when our mouse enters it, and on hover exit. Now, in order for this interactable to actually work, we need to attach a collider. So I'm just going to go ahead and attach a box collider to this right now and adjust it so it fits in nicely. And there we go. So now if we press play, we can walk up to the barrel and you'll see my mouse cursor is changing to a magnifying glass, okay? But if we click on it, it's not doing anything. And that is because we haven't actually set up anything on the corresponding events. So we could go here and, for example, on interact, maybe we just want to make the object vanish. So we'll drag in the game object here and just go game object, set active, false. So now if we interact with this barrel, it should disappear. One thing to note though is that if you are setting up the pickup or inspect systems, you don't need to connect those via the event listeners right here, as that will do it automatically behind the scenes. But yeah, that's just a quick look at how to set up interactions with the Exploration Toolkit.